Hello, and welcome to the second of 3 on-demand webinars titled From Discovery to Development, Choosing the Right Contract Service Provider, brought to you by Thermo Fisher Scientific and in partnership with the University of California, San Diego Extension Program. My name's Casey Kine, Senior Manager of Regulatory Affairs, Clinical and Compliance here at Thermo Fisher Scientific, and I'm delighted to be joined by two experts today to help shed light on integrating CGMP from clinical trials to commercialization. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Ajit Sim. Ajit established Sheba Biotechnology in 1999 to provide regulatory compliance, quality strategy and support to the biotech, pharmaceutical and medical device industry. Ajit has worked with several multinational pharmaceutical companies and products over his 30 years in industry. Ajit has successfully hosted FDA and EMA inspections and conducted several pre-approval inspections which led to successful outcomes. He is a member of PDA and is an adjunct professor and instructor at SDSU in regulatory affairs. I'd also like to welcome Professor Naresh Nayar, an experienced regulatory affairs leader with broad experience in companion diagnostic, CMC, and post-approval drug development activities. Currently, he is Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Turning Point Therapeutics. Naresh is experienced in preparing teams for regulatory agency meetings and interacting with US and international regulatory agencies. With a combined total of 50 plus years of experience as leaders in regulatory affairs in biotech, pharmaceutical, and medical device industries, both Ajit and Naresh are leading experts in regulatory requirements for drug development and biologics. So welcome Ajit and Naresh. I'm really happy to have you back for our second webinar in this series.
Thank you, Casey.
Thank you, Casey.
So there are many factors involved when selecting a contract service provider. What are some of the considerations to keep in mind when selecting the right CSP, and what questions should be asked in order to qualify the CSP?
Excellent question, Casey, especially given the climate that the pharma and biotech industry has been, in the last, couple of decades. There was a time, just as a little background, when we manufactured product within our own footprint at the company. We were in control. Then as a number of biotech companies realized that investing in infrastructure is very expensive and the return on investment may not be there, they decided, well, let's go find a contract service provider to provide these services for us. So that's where the CSP platform comes into place. And that's a huge industry today. And that industry is multinational, as we'll see it. Okay, so a majority of our small to mid-sized biotech companies and even some of the large pharmaceutical companies, even though they have built-in capacity to make their product, they do tend to outsource. Why? Because of demand, and it outstrips their ability to manufacture in-house. So they go outside, which is okay. But there are some challenges with that. One is a number of the companies that outsource are termed what is known as virtual. That means they outsource all their products for manufacturing and testing to third parties, okay, called contract service providers. And the challenge is that the FDA does not recognize the term virtual. To them, when they come into a virtual company to conduct an inspection, because you are the application holder, you're the dossier holder, you're responsible for compliance, right? But what they find is that you have handed over regulatory compliance to the CSP. And this is where one of the big challenges comes into play, is who is responsible for ensuring compliance with a contract service provider. And it's a trick question. When I ask this of my students, who's responsible? Is it the CRO, the contract research organization, okay, or the CMO, the manufacturing organization, or is it the sponsor? And the answer is the CRO or the CMO, okay, or both. But the next question is who's ultimately responsible for compliance? Ultimate responsibility lies with the sponsor. Okay, so they have to ensure that compliance, okay, of the manufacturing and testing of their pharmaceutical product is completely in their domain. Okay, and this poses a lot of challenges because we can elaborate. We need to make sure that we have the technical prowess internally to be able to assess compliance at these CMOs and CROs. Okay, when we go to do these audits, we need to ensure that we are in a position to be able to impart, okay, our knowledge on what the expectations are and what some of the nuances are that can lead to compromising the integrity and the quality of the product that is being manufactured or being tested. I hope that answers your question. Yeah?
It does, thank you. It's definitely a complicated
Yes.
field at times. Naresh, what's your experiences there?
So thank you, Casey and Ajit. So I think I might take it from a little bit different perspective, from a regulatory perspective. Uh, so I work generally would like to work backwards. Assume that you're a small biotech, and like Ajit pointed out, a lot of the biotechs are virtual. So you go to FDA to submit your application, and FDA wants to look at your compliance history. So they look at the compliance history from a number of perspectives. Ajit mentioned manufacturing. That's a key component, that whether your product is safe and you have complied with all the regulations from CMC perspective. The other part is they also look at where was your tox studies done, whether they were done in US or in Europe or in Asia Pac. So they want to know whether those compliant with the what we call them a good laboratory practices, and all the reports and everything is documented. Specifically for the GLP, I just want to emphasize that they not only look at the compliance, they also want to make sure that you have not unduly influenced the CRO to write a report in your favor, or a favorable report from an endpoint perspective. So I think that's an important part to look at when you look at the CRO. What is their history? And generally, when you look at the CRO from that perspective, you go to them or you do a desktop audit as we do these days, and also look at their FDA history. Have they received any citations of some sort from the FDA or other regulatory agencies? So that's number two, which is from a GLP perspective. And I think the third important one is from the clinical side, which is whether they are complying with the good clinical practices, whether they are documenting everything, what is their history in terms of the inspections from the FDA for their sites, because FDA can not only go to the company, they can also visit where your where you manufactured, where your tox studies are done, and where your clinical studies are or data is. You're recruiting patients and you're documenting whether there's a clinical progression or there is the drug is effective. So I think it's a quite a broad topic, but if you break down into three areas, that really helps the company to see which level of inspection or which level of expertise that they need at a given stage. So manufacturing and the tox early, what we call is a non-clinical work, and then the clinical work. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to sort of further expand on some of those points you just made, which are really valuable for people trying to choose a CSP. So what are some more of the targeted questions that could be asked when outsourcing? I know you've touched on some of those manufacturing components, but could you get a little more detailed?
Yeah, definitely, Casey. So there are a number of contract service providers out there competing for your business. Okay? And one of the big challenges is how do we go and identify who is the best fit? Okay, so typically it starts off with identifying a shortlisting a number of these CSPs to make sure first and foremost they are able to meet your technology demands. That means they have the technical elements present to be able to either manufacture your sophisticated chemistries or your straightforward manufacturing fill finish or lyophilization for freeze drying of your final product. Okay. Once you identify these companies and you have shortlisted them, the next thing to do is obviously get into a what we call as a CDA. We get into a confidentiality agreement because we need to share with them some basic information on what my product is and can you manufacture it, have you had prior experience, and so on and so forth. Okay, and sometimes we find out that there's only one or two companies around the world that are able to help you in this particular space. Okay, I had a client who was working on liposome technology, and there are very few companies that can do liposome technologies today, okay, to manufacture that. So once you get into a CDA, then the next one, obviously today with the pandemic, a lot of that is done remotely, which poses additional challenges, which we can discuss later on during this webinar. But for all intents and purposes, we would like to go there and conduct what we call as a technical assessment first. Okay, where we look at, are they able to give us the right, chemistries, the manufacturing requirements? Do they have the analytical tools present to detect the impurity profiles we need to be able to detect, either down to parts per million or parts per billion or whatever, right? Once we pass that hurdle and we are able to identify a CMO, then that information is passed on to the quality group. And the QA group usually takes this responsibility to conduct what we call as a technical compliance due diligence. And folks like us come into the picture here because we are technical. We also have had compliance, background. So we go in there and assess the capabilities of the manufacturer. Are they able to do this? So what do we look for? Obviously, I'll give an example. When I was dealing with GLP tox facilities and I used to audit them, you walk into a tox facility or even a CMO, a contract manufacturing organization, you get a gut feel. Okay, when you meet the people, you walk in through the doors, you get a gut feel, you look at the conference room, body language of the folks, all of that, right? So one of the classes I was teaching years back, I was telling my students, and this was a live class, I said, when I go into a GLP tox facility, I'm able to use my sense of smell. How good does it smell? Okay, I'm able to see the facility. How nice does it look? I'm able to hear the facility. How well is it humming? Okay, and then I get a gut feel. And the gut feel is an emotional response, right? And then I'll say, yeah, I think this facility looks good. It's going to look good. Okay. Um, so one of my students asked me, well, what is a gut feel? And I said, well, it's difficult to explain. It's like experience. Okay, there's a theoretical experience, but then there's a practical element to it. So this gut feel comes from experience. And he said, well, I paid $800 for this class, and I want to leave here knowing what the gut feel is. But that comes from experience, right? And so when we go in, whether it's a CMO for GLP or GCP or GMP activities, CRO rather, we're able to get this gut feel. Once we're able to meet the folks, look at their presentation, ask key questions, okay? And our business is we trust what you're sharing with us, but we need to verify it. That's what an FDA regulator investigator does. They say, yep, I see in the document, but now you show me that it's being done. It's trust and verification. So we try to do some spot checks. And then we go on a facility tour to be able to identify the facility. One of the key elements we look for is cleanliness. How clean are these facilities? Because keep in mind that a majority of these facilities are what we call, when we review the site master file, it says that they are a multi-product, shared equipment, manufacturing facility. What does that mean? Multi-product. Oh, they're making different products. However, they may not be making steroids or cytotoxic drugs because the potential for that, what we call as high potency active pharmaceutical ingredients, is there for contamination. We don't want that because it can impact the patient population in parts per million if there's a cross contamination. We don't want any penicillins, beta lactams, and so on. So we do an assessment the type of products they make. Then we look at cleanliness. How do they clean the equipment? Okay, to make sure there's no cross-contamination. Today, we have heard a lot in the news for a number of these metabolic disease drugs that are used for the treatment of metabolic diseases like diabetes and weight loss and high blood pressure and so on have been contaminated with a potential carcinogen. Okay. And so we go around those lines to look at and assess, is there a potential for cross-contamination? Where does contamination come from? It can come from the raw materials, from the excipients that are used in the final dosage form. It can come from personnel if it's a biologic product. It can come from the equipment because they're not cleaned right. And most importantly, the environment. Okay, because the environment has got a lot of microbes. So depending on the final dosage form of the product, we assess the environment as well. So this is how we're able to make the assessment if this CMO or CRO is going to be qualified. Now, keep in mind that today, when we did these GMP audits years back, we only focus on GMPs. But today, or GLPs, but today, we look at one other element. Again, that element is called business continuity or disaster recovery. Because if a small biotech company partners with a big CMO or a small CMO for manufacturing their product, and they're relying on them 100%, and if that company is not able to manufacture or test the product for them, then they fail to meet their timelines in the clinic. That can have devastating effects, okay, on their bottom line. So what we do is we do a risk assessment and the disaster recovery from simple things like if something happens to the facility, what's your backup? Okay, there's a contamination or you get a failed inspection, you get a 43 or a warning letter. What's your backup? Okay, how quickly can you remedy the situation? Very importantly, computerization today, 21 CFR Part 11, electronic record, electronic signatures. You have a lot of documents stored electronically. Where does it go? And when I ask this question, some of the folks look up and say in the cloud. And I say, well, it doesn't go into the cloud. It goes to some server somewhere. So we need a network schematic to be able to show that you have redundancies built in. How quickly is the data transmitted? Okay, is it encrypted? Can it get corrupted? Okay, these are all questions today that has evolved as part of CGMP. So it's quite complex. So we need a broad-based approach to identifying key CMOs and CROs. Right? I hope that answers your question.
It does, thank you. And business continuity is definitely a hot topic, as is data integrity. Naresh, do you have any more particular points on, choosing the right CDMO?
No, thanks, Casey, and thanks, Ajit. That was a great response. I just want to focus on a little bit on the global aspects of the CROs, especially if you're a smaller organization. Like I worked at many small companies. In US, you can work directly with the FDA. You can correspond, but many of the regions, countries like in Europe or Asia Pac, where you don't have the regional knowledge yourself, you want to depend on your CRO. Or the service provider, specifically for clinical studies or even for manufacturing. So what you have to realize or what you have to assess is that whether the CRO is competent enough or global enough to be able to work as an agent on your behalf in that country. What that means is that they will directly correspond with the regulatory agency in that region. Let's say, for example, South Korea or Israel or any other country, and they will work directly with them. The health agencies would recognize that they are the agents of the company. They will provide the response or the questions to them, and then they will correspond with us. So I think it is an important aspect to evaluate that whether the CRO is global enough and do they have global expertise on their sites to really deal with from the regulatory side for the company. Another important point I think I want to point out is that a lot of it, being a smaller company, you want to cover all your bases. You want to make sure that your intellectual property is protected, because that is a key for a small biotech. So you want to work with the CRO where there are no presumed conflict of interest in terms of the intellectual property. Once you, because as Ajit knows, you make many changes during the life cycle of a product, manufacturing changes, process changes, just to make sure that those changes are your intellectual property. The CRO has nothing to do with it. So it's a sort of a practical aspect of working and identifying the CROs that they don't have any of the intellectual property issues. Another practical point that I have worked through when we are selecting the CROs is get their name and do your regulatory, what I call regulatory intelligence. Take their name and put their name on the FDA website or the EMA website, and if they are really broad enough, global enough, they would have registered themselves with these health authorities, and you can get a lot of regulatory intelligence, whether they were any serious, how good they are. Obviously, you want to know there's no 483s or there is no consent decrees on them, and whether they have any consistent issues going forward with them. And I think the last one from a practical aspect is I reach out to my colleagues who have worked with some of the CROs as a last resort to get information from them that how was their interaction before starting the contract, during the contract, and if there were any issues, how they were resolved. So I think it is very important from a practical aspect to get as much as information gathered before you make a decision about a CRO, because practically once you select a CRO, in the middle of your program, whether it's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, it is very difficult to change a CRO. I've been through this process and it's not a very pretty process. So you want to make sure that the CRO, you take your time, but you have to do your due diligence from a quality perspective, from a regulatory perspective, and as Ajit pointed out, from a business perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Naresh. There's some really good practical tips, and utilizing the FDA website and knowing that there's publicly available information is really quite useful to know, as well as even looking at your contract service provider's webpage as well.
Yeah.
And they'll tell you a lot of information. So very handy. Thank you. So we've made the assumption that outsourcing is being done quite commonly in North America. But what are some of the challenges and opportunities that arise with foreign contract service providers, and what should we consider before engaging with a foreign CSP?
Excellent point, or question rather, Casey. In today's climate, again, with the pandemic, it became very evident in the April-May timeframe in the US how dependent we are on foreign manufacturers. About 70 to 80% of the active ingredients for generic products utilized in the US comes from India and China. About 40% of the dosage forms comes from there. Number of companies in the US that are innovator companies are manufacturing their early stage compounds for either registered starting material or active pharmaceutical ingredient, in foreign companies. And so what's the reason for that? Obviously, the technology resides even in the US, okay, because we have the technology base here to do that, but why are they going outside? And I'll get to the challenges in a minute, but what are the pros? The pros are several. Obviously, one of the big pros that the finance group at companies like is the cost of goods, right? Because keep in mind that a lot of the foreign manufacturers have an infrastructure where they depend internally within their country for sourcing components to manufacture their product. For example, solvents, okay? But in the US, for example, if you're making an API, an active pharmaceutical ingredient, we are relying on a foreign company to bring in some of the components. So again, the cost of good goes up because there's transportation and customs and duties and all that stuff. But with foreign companies, they don't have that. That infrastructure is all built in. So they're able to make it. And also the wage index, for example, if it's 10 in the US, it's 2 and 4 in India and China. And so given all of that, the ROIs are much higher with foreign companies. So it's very attractive. What are some of the challenges? Well, some of the challenges, obviously, when you're dealing, with a foreign manufacturer, is one, keep in mind, is time zone. Okay, time zone becomes important because when you want to have meetings, either you're supposed to be asleep and they're working, and that's when you want to have meetings. So it is practical. Second is you have to get out there frequently. I was doing a project in India and China just before the pandemic, and I used to go out to India and China every 6 to 8 weeks. Okay, long trip, but you get there because there is no substitute for actually seeing the facility. Okay, seeing the manufacturing process. And sometimes by video you can't see it because today with the pandemic you're not allowed to travel, but you can't even see it by video because there are issues related to inflammables in there, and taking a camera is not allowed. Okay, so you can't see it in real time. Plus, they may show you what you want to see rather than what you really want to see. Okay, so you have the time zone, you have distance. That's the other thing. Um, the other big challenge we have is language. Okay, so uh, if because we are dealing with different languages and cultural norms, it becomes challenging. I was recently helping a client of mine with a quality agreement with a company in Germany, and a sticky point was, well, the batch record is going to be in the German language. And my client was asking me, well, how are you going to review it if it's in the German language? And they were adamant that it has to be in the German language because the operators all do not speak English. And so we came up with a compromise. We said we needed to be in dual, in German and English. So the German part is filled in. So when we are reviewing it for disposition of our lot, what we call is release of the lot, we're able to compare it, okay, in real time, looking at the German, what they filled in, and looking at English to see what it really means, right? So we have to come up with creative ways of doing this, okay? The next one is interpretation. This is a very important element, is interpretation of US regulations. They have to follow, if they're making active pharmaceutical ingredient, ICHQ-7, the International Conference of Council on Harmonization, established between the tripartite group of the US, European Union, Japan, and ad hoc members of India and China, okay, ICHQ-7, or 21 CFR 211, or 600 supplemented with 600 for the manufacture of biologics as a drug for the US regulation. So the interpretation becomes very, very important. Are they actually trained on US regulations? Can I see the training records? Do they understand? And these are some pivotal questions we ask during an audit. So if I'm walking around on a tour and there's an operator there, I ask them, which part of the US regulation do you follow? And if they draw a blank look, then you know they're not trained on it, they're not familiar with it. And that's a big gap. So they need to be trained on it. Sometimes we conduct the audits and we also end up training them on our regulations. Okay. And it's the interpretation of the regulations. For example, cleanliness, cross-contamination, environmental zones. They mean different things to different companies and countries. And today, very importantly, one of the hot topics with the FDA is data integrity and also with clients. Data integrity breach, what constitutes data integrity? Culturally, we have found that in some countries, when they make a mistake, they don't bring it up to their supervisor because it is called saving face. In the US, you make a mistake, you say, well, I made a mistake, I'm going to correct it. But in some countries, the challenge is that they sweep it under the rug or they've changed the time or they backdate it. Why? Because they they don't want to be culpable for the mistake they made. So they say, I'm going to hide it. So we have to educate them on what constitutes a data integrity breach. And this leads us to computerization. A lot of company managements today are moving towards computerization to prevent data integrity breaches. Because you can't modify, you can't change dates or times or injection schemes on your HPLCs, for example, even the balances, they print out in real time. So you have the date and timestamp, okay, on the weights and measures, so you can't change that. So data integrity breach becomes huge. Something else we look for with foreign manufacturers is attrition rate, okay, because continuity is very important, as Naresh pointed out during the previous question, that we go from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, and as a product is being developed, there are a number of nuances in this. We would like to see the same people manufacturing and testing the product because of the nuances. Sometimes not everything is documented, so we may not be able to duplicate it 100%, but there are nuances in it. Okay, and so, for example, phase separation in an API, synthetic chemistry scheme. How do you do phase separation? Okay, can you quantify it? No, but I can qualify it because I can visually see the separation and say, okay, that's where I'm going to pull it. Okay, that fraction. So that's not documented, but the same person needs to be there. So we look at attrition rate. The quality culture comes into play. With quality culture, when I ask, what is your culture of quality? If I don't get an answer, very clear answer, that means there's no formal culture of quality. What does culture of quality mean? Culture of quality means that the product I'm manufacturing is going to be safe for the end user. That's basically what it means. That means there's quality built in from the beginning to the end. Okay, not just testing at the end to show it meets compliance. And along those lines, the role of management. Management has to play a very key role in ensuring that quality practices, are in real time and that they're integrated into the day-to-day operations. This is where body language comes into play. When we do these audits, we see how well they're interacting with each other. And that tells us whether they respect each other. They respect quality, right? And then the frequency of oversight. I think I mentioned this earlier. When we are dealing with a foreign manufacturer, um, if you go there once in 2-3 years, it may not be enough. You have to make more frequent trips because out of sight, out of mind. Okay, case in point today, we know with the pandemic, we have not been able to conduct in-site or on-site inspections and audits. We've been doing this remotely. The question is, how well are they going to be showing us that facility when we actually go there next year to see it? Is it going to be in a state of disrepair? Because the cat's away so the mice play, as they say, right? So how well are they operating in compliance? Are you breeding a culture of compliance when no one is looking? Okay, that is the culture of quality we want to see, at all manufacturers. But with foreign manufacturers, it's a challenge because of all of these cultural shifts and norms that we have. Okay. And one of the other items that we would like to see with foreign manufacturers is we want to see which facility, which suite, all the W's I talked about in session one, webinar one is all the W's. Where is it made? I want to be able to see the reactor. I want to be able to see the room. I want to see the fill line. Okay, because that adds a lot of value. So using a foreign manufacturer poses some challenges, like using them in the US. The proximity of time, distance, cultural should be taken into account. And we have had a lot of success dealing with foreign manufacturers. We have had successful pre-approval inspections and continued surveillance inspections with foreign manufacturers. Okay. All right.
Great. That's some really good insight, and I'm really pleased you touched on the human factor because skilled GMP technicians are just so valuable, and attrition is definitely an important one to consider with the foreign CSP and any CSP. Naresh, do you have anything more to add about useful advice for dealing with foreign CSPs?
Oh, thank you. And I think Ajit touched a lot on the manufacturing side. Again, I want to just emphasize a little bit of the clinical side, partly because every small company like ours that I work with at the smaller companies, even larger companies, they tend to use the CROs to supplement their internal resources. So the CRO or the service provider that you choose has to have a global footprint. I mean, because the clinical trials are global. You cannot find all the subjects in one country, for example, in US. So you are forced or you're obligated to find patients in Europe, in Asia Pac countries, in Australia, in New Zealand, and sometimes in South America, like in Brazil and Colombia. So I think the key is to be able to choose a service provider that has a really global footprint. Now, what does the global footprint means from a clinical perspective? From my side, is that they have the same rules. They follow obviously same rules and regulations as US because all the information coming from those sites will be in your application, which we call it new drug application or a BLA. So that will be included in that. So you want to make sure, as Ajit pointed out, that they are able to follow the US guidelines very closely. The other aspect is that when the application is submitted, the FDA can visit those sites. So you really have to have a very a detailed record of how the site was maintained, how many times we visited the sites, if there were deviations from the clinical protocol, how they were documented. FDA is or even the European health authorities or global health authorities, they want to know how you dealt with a deviation from a protocol. For example, if a subject was supposed to take a dose on day X, he missed the dose, he took the dose next day. They want to know how the site really documented that protocol deviation. And partly, it goes to what Ajit said, is a training. When we do the site initiation visits for with a CRO in a foreign company, we go there, we present our clinical study program, protocol, and also as a part of that, we train them that this is inclusion criteria for our protocol, this is the exclusion criteria, these are the primary endpoints, these are the secondary endpoints, so that they really understand our clinical study design. Because as I mentioned, FDA can go to these sites and really audit them. And if they find that they are not compliant with the US regulations, those patients who are recruited by those sites will not count as their application. So that's a loss. So for example, if you have a trial of 100 subjects and you recruited 10 or 12 subjects from that a particular site or particular country, FDA can say, sorry, these fall outside of the compliance criteria. We will not count them. So I think it is in companies' interest to really proactively pick a CRO and have the clinical research associates from the company visit them more often, like Ajit said. Although during the pandemic it has slowed down, but there's still ways to do to really monitor things. I think that's the key. Another, I think, the practical aspect I want to point out is FDA always comes and says, how do you manage your vendors? So it is in companies' best interest to have a SOP, which is standard operating procedure, to see how you actually manage what is your policy for managing the CROs, whether it's manufacturing with GLP or GCP, that clearly outlines what are the steps you will take. So I think FDA really likes to see that, to say that, okay, I think you're managing the CRO really well. So I think these are some of the key, just practical aspects of choosing a global CRO, so that, in the end, the goal is, like Ajit pointed out, is obviously patient safety. But as you get closer to the filing, the goal is also to get your drug approved to help the patients who have been on the study, and also in general population for those. So the goal should be to work with the CRO who is reliable, who is compliant, and who's well established globally.
Thank you, Naresh. So both of you have touched on audit process, and we've talked about this post-pandemic world and the new normal. What are some of the things you think can be done to make the audit process as seamless as possible, particularly in this virtual audit environment that we're in at the moment?
I think it's a very relevant question, Casey. Even before the pandemic, it has always been a challenge for the biotech and the pharma industry to do a live audit of their entire supply chain. It's not possible for various reasons. One is that the timing may not work out. Okay. Two is that your finance group may say there's no budget for travel, right? Three is that you may have visa problems to get a visa to go to that country. Okay. And four is that the vendor themselves may say that, we are not allowing you to audit now. You have to wait 2 or 3 years, depending on the quality agreement you have in place. Okay. So a whole host of reasons you may not be able to audit, but it's not practical to audit every CMO and CRO. So what we do is we list out, okay, all the suppliers. And that's what the FDA does when they come in for a PAI, for a pre-approval inspection. They want to know all your CMOs and CROs you have used. How do you qualify them? Okay. So we do a risk assessment. We identify the risk, we control the risk, we review the controls, and then we make a call. Which ones get audited on site and which ones don't. Okay. and those that do not get on-site audits get remote audits. But we have to have full justification and show to the regulatory body that our justification is very appropriate and not for convenience, right? Okay. So in today's climate with the pandemic, as we are not able to do these site audits, we do a remote audit. And the remote audit means that what we have to do is provide, even with a site audit, we have to provide the vendor or the CMO or the CRO with a audit agenda, a very clear agenda. Okay, and the audit agenda has some documents that we like to have them populate into a share folder or send it to us by email pre-meeting. For example, if you're looking at a manufacturing facility, I would want to see their site master file, which describes the site. I want to see their quality manual, okay, their SOP index. So I can identify the SOPs on the day of the audit so they can pull it and see it. Identify key members of the team who have worked on my manufacturing and testing process. So I can see their training records. Okay, so I look at all of this collectively to make it very efficient, be able to do a lot of these reviews beforehand. Okay, and then when we get into the audit mode and typically these are 2-day audits, and when you're on site but now being remote, sometimes it takes 3-4 days to do it because there's a language barrier, there's time differences, and all of these things. But I did an audit in Switzerland over 3 days. In the very early morning, from 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. my time, Pacific time, over 3 days because of the time difference. But nonetheless, we're able to pull it off. So you got to be creative. Okay. So the audit agenda has to be very clear what you're looking at. And if they've already manufactured a product for you, we want to look at the lot numbers they manufactured, any process deviations, any stability failure on time points, any out of specification results. All of this is assessed. So we are then able to make a call on their level of compliance. Now, keep in mind that as you're in development mode, there will be process deviations. But we have to look at the impact of the process deviations on SysPQ, the safety, identity, strength, purity, potency, and quality of the product. Okay, is there an impact on it? Sometimes there's no impact. Okay, so we need to make that call. Okay? So we're able to qualify these vendors, CMOs and CROs, with this due diligence process, even from a distance, very effectively. Okay.
Thank you. Naresh, do you have any further comments on ensuring a seamless audit?
Yeah, no, sure. Thanks, Casey. I think the key is to have a communication plan. Because of the pandemic, recent pandemic, FDA, EMA, and other global health authorities have provided guidance how to manage any of the audits, how to manage any of the protocol deviations, how to manage the patients. For example, if they're not able to travel, how we can provide the IP to them. So I think the key for the sponsor as well as the CRO is to have a very clear communication plan how these things will be documented. For the FDA and other global health authorities, I think we talked about it, traceability in the previous webinar. That's the key. All these things need to be documented that during the pandemic, we plan to follow this procedure. If there was a deviation, it should be documented as a part of the pandemic. And when the application will later go on to the FDA or EMA for review, they will be able to align that with what the guidance they had during this time. So I think the key is communication, have a written plan how things are being managed, how the studies are being managed, how whether it's a GLP manufacturing or a clinical studies are being managed during this time based on the although few guidances, but I think there are still guidances out there from the FDA and EMA.
Thank you. That's great advice. Communication's definitely key. So thank you both for your time and insight today. We've covered a lot of great information, and we also appreciate everybody who's joined us. And if you enjoyed today's discussion and are looking for some more regulatory insights, please register for our final on-demand webinar. And lastly, thank you to our University of California San Diego Extension program where both Naresh and Ajit are professors of regulatory and compliance. We look forward to you joining us again for our final seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Yeah.
Thank you, Ajit and Casey.